I'm 73 years old, and I've never told this story to anyone except my neighbor who helped me through the worst of it. Most folks would think I'm losing my mind, but what happened to me this past April up in the mountains changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in these old forests. I've been living alone in my cabin for almost 15 years now, ever since I retired from the mill. The place sits about 8 miles up a dirt road that most people wouldn't even call a road anymore. It's just me, my vegetable garden, and enough firewood to last through the coldest months. I like the quiet, always have. It started in early April with small things that I wrote off as spring wildlife getting active after the long winter. I'd wake up and find my woodpile looked different somehow. Not messed up exactly, but rearranged. The logs I'd stacked in neat rows would be organized in ways that didn't make sense. Sometimes the biggest pieces would be on top. Other times they'd be sorted by length in a way I'd never done. At first I figured it was my memory playing tricks on me. When you're pushing 75 and living alone, you start doubting yourself about little things. But it kept happening, and each time the arrangement was more deliberate, more purposeful than anything random could explain. Then I found the footprints. The first ones I spotted were near my garden on April 8th. I'd gone out to start preparing the soil for spring planting, and there in the soft dirt between the rows were prints that made me stop cold. They looked human at first glance, but wrong in every way that mattered. Too big, too wide, with toes that seemed to grip the earth like fingers. Each print was easily twice the size of my boot, maybe 18 inches long and nearly half that wide. I stood there in the morning mist, staring at those impressions in my garden soil, trying to come up with any explanation that made sense. A person in some kind of oversized shoes, maybe. Someone playing a prank, though I couldn't imagine who'd hike 8 miles up a mountain road just to mess with an old man's garden. The prints were deep too, pressed into the ground like whatever made them weighed far more than any normal person. That night, I lay in bed listening to sounds I'd never noticed before. The forest has its usual nighttime symphony. Owls, wind through the trees, maybe a raccoon or possum rustling around. But underneath all that, I started hearing something else. Heavy footsteps circling my cabin, slow, deliberate steps that would start at the front porch, move around the side, pause at my bedroom window, then continue around back toward the shed. The steps were too heavy for a person, too regular for a bear. Bears lumber and crash through the underbrush. This was something that moved with purpose, something that was trying to be quiet but couldn't quite manage it because of its size. I'd track the sound as it made its circuit around my home, sometimes stopping right outside my window where I'd feel like something was standing there, just listening back. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, though I couldn't say what good it would do. The morning after the first night of footsteps, I found something that shook me more than the prints. My water pump sits about 50 feet from the cabin, and the ground around it was soaked. Not just damp from dew or a little leak, but saturated like someone had been using it heavily during the night. The pump handle was still wet, and there were muddy marks on the metal where large hands had gripped it. There were no human footprints leading to or from the pump. Just those same massive prints I'd found in the garden, only now they were everywhere around my water source. Whatever this thing was, it had been drinking from my pump in the middle of the night, and it was smart enough to approach from the rocky ground where it wouldn't leave as many tracks. I started checking the pump every morning after that. 3 times a week, I'd find evidence that my midnight visitor had returned. Wet ground, muddy hand marks on the handle, and sometimes long, coarse hairs caught on the metal housing. Dark brown, almost black hairs that were thicker than anything I'd ever seen. Definitely not from a bear or deer. By mid-April, whatever was visiting me got bolder. One morning I woke up to find a neat pile of split logs on my front porch that I definitely hadn't put there. Good logs too, split clean and dry, ready to burn. It was like some kind of trade was happening without my permission. This thing was using my water, and in return, it was leaving me firewood. The arrangement might have been almost friendly if it wasn't so terrifying. I was living with something that was strong enough to split logs with its bare hands and smart enough to understand the concept of payment. Around the same time, vegetables started going missing from my early spring plantings. Not just a few here and there like you'd expect from deer or rabbits, but entire plants pulled up by the roots. My lettuce, spinach, and radishes would disappear overnight. Whatever was taking them knew the difference between the parts worth eating and the parts to leave behind. It would take the tender young greens and leave the roots. Take the radish bulbs and leave the leaves. I started feeling watched all the time. Not just at night when I'd hear the footsteps, but during the day when I was splitting wood or working in the garden. That feeling you get when someone's staring at you, except magnified until it made my skin crawl. I'd look up at the tree line expecting to see someone, but there was never anything there. On April 19th, I decided to set up a simple test. I left a small pile of carrots from my root cellar on the stump where I usually split kindling, then watched from my kitchen window. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Then, just as the sun was setting, I saw movement at the edge of the forest. A massive shape emerged from between the trees. Easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. It approached the stump cautiously, constantly looking around, picked up the carrots, and examined them carefully before eating them one by one. Then it placed something else on the stump, a cluster of some kind of wild berries I didn't recognize, and melted back into the forest. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the binoculars steady. This wasn't some bear or other known animal. This was something that understood reciprocity, that had consciously chosen to leave a gift in exchange for what it had taken. The next morning, I found where it was living. About 100 yards into the forest, just visible from my kitchen window, someone had built a crude lean-to out of branches and pine boughs. It was skillfully made, waterproof and sturdy, but constructed entirely without tools. The branches were broken off rather than cut, woven together in a way that showed intelligence, but not human knowledge of building techniques. I got my binoculars and studied that shelter for hours. It was clearly being used. I could see a depression in the ground where something large had been sleeping, and there were more of those coarse, dark hairs caught on the branches. There were also tools scattered around the shelter, stones that had been shaped for specific purposes, carved wooden implements, and what looked like a primitive but effective system for collecting and storing rainwater. Over the next few days, I watched the creature's routine. It would emerge from the shelter around dusk, visit my water pump, sometimes rearrange my woodpile or leave gifts, then return to its lean-to before dawn. During the day, I occasionally caught glimpses of it foraging deeper in the forest, always moving with that same deliberate caution. On April 23rd, everything changed. I'd been feeling under the weather for a couple of days, thought it was just seasonal allergies at first, nothing serious. But that morning, I woke up dizzy and weak, and when I tried to get up to make coffee, my legs gave out, and I fell hard against the kitchen counter. I must have blacked out for a minute because the next thing I knew, I was on the floor with blood running down my forehead from where I'd hit the corner of the cabinet. I managed to crawl to my recliner and just sat there, too dizzy to do much of anything. The fire had died down to coals during the night, and I didn't have the strength to add more wood. I was shivering despite the warming spring air, confused and probably running a fever, and starting to realize that being sick and alone 8 miles from the nearest neighbor wasn't a good situation for a man my age. That's when I heard voices outside, not the usual nighttime footsteps, but conversation. Deep voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but more urgent now. Excited or worried, I couldn't tell which. The voices got closer to the cabin, and I heard what sounded like an argument. different tones and rhythms like they were debating something important. Then came 3 deliberate knocks on my door, polite almost, like a neighbor coming to check on me. I was too weak and dizzy to get up, so I just called out that the door was unlocked. I figured if they wanted to come in, they were going to whether I invited them or not, and I was in no shape to stop them. The door opened slowly, carefully, and the largest living thing I'd ever seen ducked through my doorway. It had to be 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark brown hair that was lighter on the chest and face. The proportions were wrong for either a human or an ape. Broader shoulders, longer arms, a face that was somehow both primitive and intelligent. Its eyes were the most unsettling part. Dark and thoughtful, unmistakably aware. This wasn't some mindless beast. This was someone, not something. It looked around my cabin, taking in the dying fire, the scattered firewood, and me slumped in my chair, bleeding from a head wound. Then it made a sound that I can only describe as concerned, a low, questioning rumble that somehow conveyed worry. 2 more of them came through the door behind the first one. One was clearly female, with different proportions and longer hair around the face. The third looked younger, maybe an adolescent. They moved into my cabin like they'd been planning this visit, spreading out to examine different parts of my home with obvious intelligence and purpose. The largest one, who seemed to be in charge, approached my chair and knelt down to look at my head wound. Its hands were enormous, fingers thick as sausages, but it touched the cut on my forehead with surprising gentleness. It examined the blood, looked at my eyes, then made a series of sounds to the others that were clearly communication. The creature studied my pupils by tilting my head toward what light was coming through the windows, checking for signs of concussion. It felt along my skull with those massive fingers, probing gently for swelling or other injuries. When it found a tender spot where I'd hit the counter, it made a concerned rumbling sound and showed the others. The female left and returned from outside a few minutes later with plants I didn't recognize. Some kind of moss that was still damp from the morning dew, and what looked like roots she'd dug up from somewhere nearby. She moved with purpose, clearly knowing exactly what she was looking for. She handed the plants to the male, who examined them briefly before beginning to work on my wound. The moss was incredibly clean and soft. She must have found it growing near clean water. The male used it to gently dab away the dried blood around my cut. Then he took the roots and began chewing them in his own mouth. At first I was repulsed, but I realized he was breaking them down and mixing them with his saliva to create a paste. He applied this mixture to my head wound like a poultice. It stung sharply at first, then gradually went numb. The chewing wasn't just to soften the roots. His saliva contained enzymes that activated the healing properties of whatever plant he was using. The numbing effect told me there were natural painkillers in the mixture. While the male tended to my injury, the younger one was rebuilding my fire with impressive skill. It didn't just throw logs on randomly. It carefully selected pieces of wood from my pile, arranging kindling in a pattern that would burn hot and clean. It blew on the coals with controlled breaths, feeding the flames exactly the right amount of air. The female had gone back outside and returned with my water bucket filled from the pump. But she'd also brought other things, early spring greens that she had foraged from around my property, some kind of wild onions, and what looked like tree sap in a piece of curved bark she was using as a container. She took my cast iron pot and filled it with the clean water, setting it over the fire to heat. Then she began adding the foraged plants in a specific order. The greens first, then the wild onions, finally a small amount of the tree sap. She didn't use any of my stored food or venture into my kitchen cabinets. Everything came from outside, from her knowledge of what the land provided. The smell that rose from the pot was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, rich and earthy, with a complexity that spoke of deep knowledge about which plants work together. When she offered it to me, she helped me drink it slowly, small sips at first to make sure I could keep it down, then gradually larger amounts as my stomach settled. They worked around me for what felt like hours, taking turns checking my temperature, bringing me water, keeping the fire going. The largest one seemed to be monitoring my condition, occasionally making sounds to the others that were clearly instructions. But they weren't just medical sounds, there was conversation happening too. I started to pick up on the rhythms of their speech. The deep, rumbling sounds weren't just grunts or animal noises, but a sophisticated language with tones and inflections that conveyed meaning. The male would make a series of sounds with rising pitch that seemed to be questions. The female would respond with shorter, more definitive sounds that seemed to be answers. The young one made faster, higher-pitched sounds that reminded me of how teenagers talk. As the day wore on and I felt stronger, I became more aware of how they moved around my cabin. They weren't clumsy or destructive despite their size. They stepped carefully to avoid creaking floorboards, moved objects gently so they wouldn't break, and seemed to understand instinctively how much weight my furniture could bear. The male noticed me watching them and came to sit beside my chair. Up close, his face was even more remarkable. The bone structure was clearly not human, but the intelligence in his eyes was unmistakable. He studied my face the way I was studying his, and I got the feeling we were both trying to figure out what the other was thinking. He reached out slowly and touched my hand, comparing our fingers. His hand was easily twice the size of mine, with thick calluses and old scars from a lifetime of living in the wilderness. But his touch was gentle, almost reverent. Then he did something that completely surprised me. He pointed to himself and made a sound, a deep, rumbling thrum. Then he pointed to me and waited expectantly. I pointed to myself and said my name slowly and clearly. He repeated it back, not quite right, but recognizable. His voice was much deeper than a human's, with an odd resonance that seemed to come from deep in his chest. The female noticed what was happening and came over with the young one. They went through the same ritual, each giving me their name sound and learning mine. But their communication was primitive, single words, basic concepts. Thrum pointed at the fire. "Burn life," he rumbled. I repeated fire back to him. He shook his massive head and pointed again. "Burn life." It took me a while to understand. To him, fire wasn't just combustion. It was a living thing that consumed wood to create warmth and light. Everything was alive in his worldview. The female, who I learned was called something like Root No, pointed to the medicine she'd made. Plant help. "Medicine," I offered. She considered this, then shook her head. "Plant help man. Plant choose help." Even with their limited words, she was expressing something profound. That plants weren't passive ingredients, but active participants in healing, choosing to help those who approach them with respect. The creature I'd started thinking of as Thrum seemed particularly interested in cause and effect. He would point at things and ask single-word questions in his rumbling voice. He pointed at my electric lantern. "Light trapped?" When I flipped the switch, he watched intently. "Light trapped how?" I tried to explain electricity, but he wasn't interested in the mechanics. He touched the glass, felt the warmth. "Sun piece," he concluded. "Man-trapped sun piece." It wasn't primitive thinking. It was a different way of understanding the world. To him, electricity was captured sunlight, and my devices were tools for holding and releasing that energy. Root No was fascinated by my canned food. She picked up a can of beans, shook it. "Food trapped?" "Preserved," I said. "Kept safe." She made a disapproving sound. "Food dead, no life flow?" She was right in a way I'd never considered. To her, food had life force that was diminished when processed and stored. Fresh plants had life flow that nourished not just the body, but something deeper. The young one, I started calling him Quick Learn, was the most curious about human concepts. He picked up one of my books. "No captured?" he asked. "Knowledge, yes. Stories and information." He flipped through the pages, understanding immediately that the marks represented ideas. Man make no pictures, quick learn like. But when I showed him photographs, he was puzzled. He studied a picture of a mountain, then looked out my window at the real mountains. Mountain spirit trapped? I realized he was asking if photography captured the soul or essence of what it depicted. In his worldview, everything had a spirit, and he was concerned that images might somehow imprison those spirits. As evening approached, they had a discussion among themselves that seemed to be about whether to stay the night. I gathered from their gestures and tones that they were concerned about leaving me alone, but also worried about being discovered. In the end, Thrum made what seemed to be an executive decision. They would stay. Before they settled down for the night, Thrum did something that moved me deeply. He went to my bookshelf and selected one of my books, a collection of nature photography. He brought it to me and made sounds that clearly meant he wanted me to show him what was in it. We spent the next hour going through the book together. He would point to a photograph of a mountain or forest or animal, and I would tell him what it was and where it was taken. He seemed to recognize many of the locations, making excited sounds and gestures that suggested he had been to those places. When we came to a photograph of a grizzly bear, he pointed and made sounds. But instead of the flowing stories I'd imagined, his words were simple and profound. "Bear brother," Thrum said, touching the page. "Same mountain." "You know bears?" I asked. "No." "Respect, give space." He gestured with his massive hands, showing distance. "Bear teach, strong, no mean take all." Through those few simple words, he was explaining an entire philosophy, that strength didn't give you the right to dominate others, a lesson he'd learned from observing bears. Rootno pointed to a forest scene. "Tree talk," she said simply. "Trees talk?" She nodded gravely. "Root words, wind words, tree tell tree, water here, danger there." She was describing what human science was only beginning to understand about how forests communicate through root systems and chemical signals. But to her, it wasn't science. It was just obvious truth. Quick Learn was fascinated by the photographs of different landscapes. He'd point to each one and say things like, "Desert, thirsty place. Ocean, too much water. Citystone forest, no life flow." Each simple phrase contained layers of meaning. Cities were forests made of stone that blocked the natural flow of life energy. Deserts weren't empty but thirsty. The ocean had too much of what deserts needed. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, despite having 3 enormous creatures in my cabin. There was something deeply comforting about their presence, a sense of being protected that I hadn't felt in years. Every few hours I would wake up to find one of them checking on me, adjusting my blankets or adding wood to the fire. When I woke up the next morning, they were preparing to leave, but not before giving me detailed instructions about caring for my head wound. The female showed me how to identify the plants they'd use for medicine, where to find them in the forest around my cabin, and how to prepare them. Thrum demonstrated a technique for testing my own pupils using a mirror, checking for signs of delayed concussion. Most remarkably, the young one had spent part of the night creating a detailed drawing on a piece of birch bark. Using charcoal from the fire, he'd mapped out the area around my cabin, marking locations where medicinal plants grew, safe water sources, and shelter spots in case of emergencies. It was more detailed and accurate than any map I'd ever seen of my immediate area. Before they left, Thrum made it clear through gestures that they would return to check on me. He showed me 3 fingers, then pointed to the sun and made an arc across the sky. They would be back in 3 days. He also showed me how to arrange stones and sticks in specific patterns if I needed help before then, and where to place these signals so they would be found. The most profound moment came just before they departed. The female approached me and gently placed her enormous hand on my chest, over my heart. She made a sound that had all the depth and warmth of a mother comforting her child. Then she touched her own chest and made the same sound. I understood. She was telling me that I was now part of their family. They returned exactly 3 days later, just as Thrum had promised. This time they knocked before entering, and when I called for them to come in, they did so more confidently. Thrum checked my head wound, which was healing cleanly, and seemed satisfied with my recovery. But this visit was different. Thrum looked troubled. He sat heavily and spoke a single word. Takers. Takers? I repeated. Root-No joined him, her expression grim. Men take. No give back. Quick-Learn elaborated in his simple way. Machine beasts eat forest. Loud hurt coming. I realized they were talking about logging operations or development. Through their broken phrases, I pieced together that they had seen increased human activity in the surrounding areas. How far? I asked. Thrum held up his massive hand, fingers spread, then made a walking motion. 5 days' travel, maybe. Not close, but close enough to worry them. We show, Root-No said, standing. You understand? They wanted me to come with them to see what they'd seen. I bundled up and followed them into the woods. They moved through the forest like they owned it, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under branches without making a sound. I crashed along behind them, but they were patient with my clumsiness. They led me higher into the mountains than I'd ever gone, following paths I couldn't even see. After 2 hours of steady climbing, we reached a ridge that offered a view of the valley below. Thrum pointed down at a distant clearing where tiny specks of yellow machinery moved among fallen trees. Even from miles away, I could see the geometric scars where dozers had carved roads through the forest. See? Root-No said sadly. Take. The operation was massive. Hundreds of acres of clear-cut forest stretching into the distance. What had once been unbroken wilderness was now a patchwork of bare earth and stumps. Quick-Learn pointed to a stream that ran through the devastation. Water path hurt, fish gone. I could see the muddy runoff from the logging operation turning the stream brown. The delicate ecosystem that had existed here for millennia was being destroyed in months. This drive us back, Thrum said, his voice heavy with loss. Soon no place left. For the first time, I truly understood what my presence meant to them. I wasn't just a curiosity or even a friend, I was a hope. Proof that some humans could live differently, could choose harmony over domination. We teach you? Root-No said simply. You remember when we gone? That's when I realized this wasn't just about friendship or even survival. They were entrusting me with something precious, their way of seeing the world. They were making me a keeper of their knowledge in case their people couldn't survive what was coming. Back at the spring, Root-No began teaching me about the plants, but her lessons were unlike anything I'd expected. She pointed to a cluster of wild ginger, rootworm. For medicine? For cold inside. She touched her chest, then her head. Body cold, spirit cold, rootworm help both. She wasn't just talking about physical symptoms. In her understanding, illness affected the whole being, body, mind, and spirit, and healing required addressing all three. Thrum showed me how to recognize different types of trees by their energy rather than their appearance. He'd place his massive hand on a trunk and close his eyes. Oak strong, hold earth power. Willow bend, teach flow with. Pine straight, show sky path. Each tree had lessons to teach about how to live. Oaks demonstrated strength and grounding. Willows taught flexibility and adaptation. Pines showed how to reach toward light while staying rooted. Quick Learn was fascinated by my axe, but not for the reasons I expected. When I showed him how to split wood, he studied the tool carefully. Metal sharp, he said, running his finger along the edge, but sharp cut both ways. What do you mean? He gestured to the split log, then to the forest around us. Tool help. Tool hurt. Same tool. He was expressing something profound about technology, that every tool carried the potential for both creation and destruction, and wisdom lay in choosing how to use that power. Your people, he said, struggling with the concepts, make many tools. Forget tool, choose you, not you choose tool. I understood. He was saying that humans had become slaves to their technology instead of masters of it. On April 26th, something happened that showed me another side of their nature. I woke in the middle of the night to sounds outside, not the usual footsteps, but something more urgent. Voices in their rumbling language, discussing something with obvious concern. I got up and peered out my window. In the moonlight, I could see all three of them gathered near the tree line. Thrum was kneeling beside something on the ground, while Root No gathered plants by moonlight and Quick Learn kept watch. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. As I approached, I saw what had their attention. A young deer with an injured leg, probably caught in an old snare that some careless hunter had left behind. The deer should have been terrified of these massive creatures, but it lay still as Root No applied some kind of poultice to its wound. Thrum looked up as I approached. Small runner hurt, he said simply. Wire bite deep. I shined my light on the deer's leg and saw where a snare had cut through the skin. The wound was infected, probably days old. Help? I asked. Root No nodded toward my cabin. Clean water, soft cloth. I brought what she asked for, watching in amazement as she cleaned the wound with more skill than most veterinarians. She spoke to the deer in soft rumbles, and somehow the animal stayed calm throughout the entire process. Why isn't it afraid? I whispered to Quick Learn. Fear comes from not knowing, he said. Deer know we help. It was a profound statement about trust and intention. Animals could sense their purpose, could tell the difference between those who meant harm and those who meant help. When Root No finished treating the wound, she didn't try to restrain the deer or keep it for observation. She simply stepped back and made a soft sound that clearly meant go. The deer stood carefully, tested its weight on the injured leg, then looked directly at each of us in turn. It was unmistakably an acknowledgement, a thank you. Then it bounded away into the forest, moving freely for the first time in days. You do this often? I asked. Always, Thrum said simply. Forest children need help. We help. Part of keeping. This was what being a forest keeper really meant. Not just living in harmony with nature, but taking active responsibility for the welfare of all creatures who shared their territory. On April 29th, something happened that tested the trust we'd been building. I was working in my garden when I heard voices approaching through the forest. Human voices. 2 hikers had gotten lost and were following the old logging road, hoping it would lead them back to the main trail. They were arguing loudly about which direction to go, crashing through the underbrush, making enough noise to wake the dead. I knew immediately that my 3 friends were nearby. I'd learned to recognize the subtle signs of their presence. The sudden silence of birds in a particular area, the feeling of being watched. They were there, hidden somewhere in the forest around my cabin, and these hikers were walking right through their territory. The hikers spotted my cabin and approached, clearly relieved to find signs of human habitation. They were city folks, inadequately dressed for the mountains, carrying expensive gear they didn't know how to use properly. They asked for directions back to the main trail and wanted to know if they could rest for a few minutes and refill their water bottles. I gave them directions and let them use my pump, all while knowing that my friends were watching every move. The hikers were loud and careless, leaving trash around my pump area and stomping through the forest without any awareness of the life around them. One of them picked up a stick and threw it at a squirrel, laughing when the animal fled. The other kicked over a small cairn of stones that I now recognized as one of their trail markers. After they left, I waited. An hour passed, then 2. Just as the sun was setting, Thrum emerged from the forest alone. He approached slowly, and I could see the tension in his movements. We sat together on my front porch as darkness fell. Through our growing vocabulary, we had our first serious conversation about the difference between humans. "Those men," Thrum said simply, "take people." "Take people?" "See thing, take thing, no ask, no give back." He gestured toward where the hikers had gone, like machine beasts in valley. I understood. The hikers represented everything his people feared about human contact. The casual destruction, the assumption that everything in nature existed for human use. "You different," he said, studying my face. "You ask before take. You give back more." Root-No emerged from the forest with quick learn. She carried something in her hands, the trash the hikers had left behind. She set it down between us without a word. "They poison forest," she said simply. "Drop bad things, not see." Quicklearn picked up a plastic water bottle. "This never become Earth again?" "No," I said sadly, "it lasts forever." He stared at the bottle with the kind of horror I might reserve for a weapon of mass destruction. To him, creating something that couldn't return to the earth was an act of profound violence against the natural order. "Your people forget," Thrum said quietly, "all things borrowed from earth. Must give back." That night, they taught me their most important lesson. Everything was part of an eternal cycle of borrowing and returning. Trees borrowed minerals from the soil and returned them when they died. Animals borrowed life from plants and returned it through their bodies. Humans had forgotten they were part of this cycle, had started taking without giving back. "We remember for them," Root-No said simply. "Keep the balance until they remember too." Over the next week, Thrum's family visited daily. Through our growing ability to communicate, I learned more about their world. They called themselves something that translated roughly as forest keepers. They'd been living in these mountains for longer than they had words to describe. Hundreds of generations, maybe thousands. According to Quick Learn, who was picking up English words but expressing complex ideas in simple phrases, there were others like them scattered through remote mountain ranges. "Few people left," he said sadly. "Machine beasts take home places." "How many?" I asked. He struggled with numbers, finally holding up both hands multiple times. Maybe a few hundred individuals total, living in small family groups like this one. "We different from old time," Root-No explained. "Old time, many forest people. Now, few people hide. They avoided humans not out of hostility, but out of hard experience. Through Quick Learn's simple but profound words, I learned about their history with my species. Long past, your people and our people share forest," he said. "Both know balance." "What changed?" "Your people forget Earth Mother. Start, take, no give. Our people hide or die." "But I was different," he explained. "I lived quietly, took only what I needed. I reminded them of how humans used to be. Root No taught me about their relationship with plants. Every plant had a spirit, a purpose, a role in the greater web of life. Plant spirits choose help us, she explained as she prepared medicine. We ask permission. Plants say yes or no. How do you ask? She showed me a ritual I would have dismissed as superstition before, but now recognized as sophisticated communication. She would touch a plant gently, close her eyes, and wait. Sometimes she would move on to another plant. Sometimes she would carefully harvest what she needed. Plant ready to give, plant give, she said simply. Plant need keep strength, we leave alone. Thrum taught me about their understanding of time and cycles. Human thinking was linear, past, present, future. Their thinking was circular, everything returning, everything connected. You think one life important, he said, struggling with the concept. We think all life important. Your body die, but life energy continue. Continue how? He gestured to the forest around us. Feed trees, trees feed deer, deer feed wolves, wolves die, feed trees. All connected, all eternal. Death wasn't an ending in their worldview, but a transformation, an energy exchange that kept the whole system alive. They taught me things about the forest that completely changed how I thought about the world around my cabin. I learned to read signs I'd never noticed before. Scratches on trees that marked territorial boundaries, arrangements of stones that indicated water sources, subtle trail markers that showed safe passage through difficult terrain. They showed me places I'd never found despite living here for 15 years. Hidden valleys where rare plants grew, caves that provided shelter in bad weather, overlooks that offered views of the entire mountain range. It was like discovering that I'd been living in the lobby of a vast mansion without realizing there were hundreds of other rooms. Most importantly, they taught me about balance. Thrum spent hours showing me how every element of the forest was connected to every other element, how taking too much of one thing would affect everything else, how the health of the tiniest insects determined the health of the largest trees, how humans fit into that web of relationships when they lived thoughtfully, and how they destroyed it when they didn't. It wasn't environmental science as humans understand it, but something deeper and more intuitive, a way of thinking that saw the forest as a living organism that needed care and respect to stay healthy. They were its immune system, maintaining the balance that kept everything thriving. The female, who I'd started calling Sage because of her deep knowledge of plants and healing, taught me to make their medicines from forest plants. She showed me how to prepare poultices for wounds, teas for stomach problems, and salves for burns and cuts. Her knowledge was encyclopedic. She seemed to know the properties of every plant that grew within miles of my cabin. Scout was endlessly curious about human technology and culture. Through our conversations, I realized that his people had been observing human society from a distance for generations, trying to understand how we developed so differently from them. He asked questions about cities, about agriculture, about why humans seemed to need so many possessions when the forest provided everything necessary for life. But it was Thrum who shared the most profound knowledge. Through stories told in our mixed language of words and gestures, he taught me about their spiritual relationship with the natural world. They didn't see themselves as separate from nature, but as part of it, with specific roles and responsibilities in maintaining the health of their territory. They had ceremonies and traditions that honored the changing seasons, the cycles of plant and animal life, the delicate balance of predator and prey. They understood concepts that human science was only beginning to recognize: how forests communicate through fungal networks, how animal behavior patterns affect plant growth, how weather systems respond to changes in forest composition. As our final week together in April drew to a close, I realized they were preparing to leave for an extended period. Scout explained that they had obligations to other groups of their people, information to share, resources to distribute. They would be gone through the summer and fall, returning when the snows came. Thrum was concerned about leaving me alone. Through gestures and Scout's translation, he made it clear that I was under their protection now. If I needed help, I should leave specific signals at certain places in the forest, and someone would come. He showed me how to arrange stones and sticks in patterns that would communicate different types of emergencies. They spent their last few days with me transferring as much knowledge as possible. Sage taught me to identify and prepare dozens of medicinal plants. Scout helped me understand their system of trail markers and territorial signs. Thrum shared what I can only call spiritual knowledge, how to move through the forest with respect, how to take only what was offered, how to give back more than I received. On their last morning, they brought me gifts unlike anything they'd shared before. Tools made from stone and bone that were works of art as much as functional implements. Containers woven from plant fibers that were waterproof and nearly unbreakable. Seeds from plants that didn't grow naturally in my area, but that they thought would thrive in my garden with proper care. Thrum made a speech in his rumbling language that Scout translated for me. He said that I was no longer just a human living in their forest, but a member of their community. A forest keeper in my own right, with all the responsibilities that entailed. If others of their people encountered me, they would know me as friend and ally. He also gave me a warning. Other humans were beginning to explore the remote areas where his people lived. Development was creeping up the mountains, bringing roads and machinery and noise. His people would have to retreat further into the wilderness, and contact with me might become dangerous for both sides. If anyone ever asked me about them, I should say nothing. Their survival depended on remaining hidden. Scout made me promise that I would never reveal their location or describe them to other humans. Some secrets were too important to share. They left at dawn on April 30th, melting into the forest like they'd never been there at all. But they left behind a changed man and a changed understanding of what it meant to live in harmony with the natural world. I spent the rest of spring and early summer implementing everything they taught me. I restructured my garden according to their principles, growing plants in relationships that supported each other. I learned to move through the forest so quietly that animals didn't flee when they saw me coming. I practiced their techniques for reading weather and seasons, for finding resources and avoiding dangers. Most importantly, I started seeing the forest as they saw it, not as a collection of individual trees and animals, but as a single living system of which I was a small but important part. Every action I took had consequences that rippled through the entire web of relationships. Every choice was an opportunity to either contribute to the health of the whole or to damage it. The medicinal plants they'd introduced to my garden thrived beyond my wildest expectations. The seeds they'd given me produced vegetables unlike anything I'd ever grown. More nutritious, more flavorful, perfectly adapted to the local soil and climate. My understanding of the forest deepened to the point where I could navigate by their trail markers and read the subtle signs they used to communicate with each other. But more than the practical knowledge, they'd given me something profound, a sense of belonging to something larger than myself. A role in the ancient dance of life that had been going on in these mountains for millennia. I haven't seen them since that April, though I sometimes find signs that they've passed through the area. A gift left on my porch, usually something I need just when I need it most. Trail markers that weren't there the day before. Rearrangements of stones near my water source that tell me they're well and thinking of me. I've kept my promise to them. When hikers or hunters ask if I've seen anything unusual in these woods, I say no and mean it. What I've seen isn't unusual at all. It's the most natural thing in the world, if you understand what natural really means. I'm an old man now, and I won't be around much longer. When I'm gone, this cabin will probably be found and demolished to make way for whatever development project is next on the list. The garden will be paved over, the forest will be logged, and the careful balance that has existed here for thousands of years will be destroyed in the name of progress. But somewhere in the deep wilderness, in places that don't appear on any map, the forest keepers will continue their ancient work. They'll preserve the old knowledge and the old ways, waiting for the day when humans remember that we're not separate from nature but part of it. I count myself lucky beyond measure to have been accepted into their world, even briefly. They taught me that there's more magic and mystery and wisdom in this world than I ever imagined. They showed me that the greatest adventures aren't found in exotic, distant places, but in learning to truly see and understand the natural world that surrounds us every day. Most of all, they taught me that we're not alone on this planet, and we never have been. We share it with other forms of intelligence that have their own rights, their own purposes, their own essential roles to play in the great web of life. The question isn't whether we'll discover them, but whether we'll learn to coexist with them before it's too late. I write this from my cabin on a warm evening in late September, watching the first hints of autumn color appear on the mountainsides. The fire is low, my belly is full, and I'm surrounded by the gifts and knowledge that my forest keeper friends shared with me. Somewhere out there in the darkness, they're living their lives according to principles that our civilization abandoned long ago. I may never see them again, but I know they're there. Guardians of the wild places, keepers of the old wisdom, bridges between the human world and the natural world that sustains us all. And knowing that makes all the difference in how I see the forest, how I live my life, and how I face whatever time I have left. The most important lesson they taught me is that how we live matters more than what we accomplish, that taking care of the world around us is its own reward, and that the greatest honor any of us can achieve is to be worthy of the trust of those who share this beautiful, fragile planet with us. For more interesting stories like this, check this out.